This morning's passage from Acts that we heard Ivan read a few moments ago is an interesting interlude from the passage that's surrounded. In the verses before it and the verses to follow, the story of Acts is preoccupied with all of Paul's travels and trials. And then right smack dab in the middle of all of Paul's adventures, we have a few brief chapters on stories of Peter. The story that we heard this morning is the one that we'll be focusing our attention on. It doesn't really have anything to do with Peter at all. There's a number of unusual details that make this story of Tabitha stand out. First, she is one of only a handful of people, most of whom are disciples, who is noted in Scripture as having both a Hebrew and a Greek name. Her Hebrew name, Tabitha. Her Greek name, Dorcas. Both words mean gazelle, an animal who was seen as possessing much grace. Now, there's one word in this passage that should cause us to pause. It's the word disciple, found there in verse 36. It's an easy word to just read over and keep on going. After all, disciple is a word we hear and use all the time in the New Testament. But if we were reading this in Greek, in the original language, it should be enough to stop us dead in our tracks. Because the word used here for disciple is the feminine form of the verb, meaning it is specifically naming Tabitha as a female disciple. It's the only time in all of Scripture that that word is used in that form. It's this small fact, this seemingly innocent little word, which becomes the key to unlocking the meaning behind this story. But to understand the how and the why, we need to explore a little bit further as to who this Tabitha woman is. Now, Tabitha wasn't just a good person. Rather, Scripture says that her life overflowed with good works and compassionate acts on behalf of those in need. Particularly, it seems, to the widows of her community. She made clothing for them. As the women in the room when Peter arrives make a point of showing him. From the Greek, we can see that the widows don't just show Peter some great sewing that Tabitha has done, but they're showing the actual clothing they're wearing. The garments on their own bodies have been made and provided by Tabitha. These gifts and the mention of the upper room in her house make clear that Tabitha was a woman of some means. She had some wealth. Now, if we put this together with the description of Tabitha as a disciple, what we have here is a person who heard and who lived Jesus' teachings. Now, a disciple is more than someone who hears and believes. A disciple is one who follows.
Amen.
A disciple is an apprentice. Today's word has skewed the meaning of the word follow, so we need to break this down just a little bit. Because today, when we say we follow someone or something, it means we're keeping tabs on them. Or maybe it's just that we take an interest in them. We follow a particular sports team. We follow someone on Facebook or Twitter. But to follow someone in biblical times, to be a disciple or follower of Jesus Christ, means that you are an apprentice. It's not enough for you to just hear them, to like what they have to say, to believe in them. You do your best to imitate them, so that you might one day be just like them. In the description we are given of Tabitha, we have someone who has obviously heard Jesus' teaching and is now acting in a way that is congruent with that teaching. She would have heard Jesus' teachings on compassion, on care for the marginalized, and so she changed her life appropriately, especially as she has come to embody Jesus' instructions on the care for the least of these as found in Matthew 25. She used what she had. She used that wealth, that access to resources to care for those who didn't. And it seems she did all of this without a special assignment or appointment. Unlike the male disciples in Acts 6, who had to be appointed to serve over the needs of the widows using the combined assets of the Christian community, Tabitha heard the word of Christ and enacted her mission of providing clothing and other garments out of her own assets. In fact, this giving that overflowed was accompanied by acts of compassion. Now, Tabitha did more than follow Marie Kondo in cleaning out the excess of her closets. No, she was doing more than tidying up. She was changing her life, dedicating every bit of her life to the care of those in need in her community. But then she died. Now, this fact in itself is of no great surprise. I mean, we're all going to die someday. And the death of disciples, whether of natural causes or those who were martyred, was common, as is noted in 1 Thessalonians 4. But it's what happens next that becomes unusual and points us to the message of hope brought about by the resurrection of Christ. Peter was nearby. And not just any messenger, but 2 of the male disciples are immediately sent to fetch him and to bring him at once to Tabitha's home. Now, this next part might leave us with questions as Peter raises her from the dead. For all of us who have experienced the death of a loved one, we might wonder, why don't these kinds of things happen today? And why weren't other disciples, like Stephen, who was stoned, why weren't the others resurrected? We must remember that all of Scripture is written that it might point us to a greater truth. The point of this passage isn't that Tabitha gets her life back, but that the life Tabitha lived will not and does not end. Tabitha appears as the very embodiment of Christ's compassion. As a disciple of Jesus, Tabitha lived a life of generosity toward the poor and the marginalized. And her death would have rocked that community where she had been a pillar. Without her good works and overflowing compassion, the widows of Joppa would suffer. Her resurrection is a resurrection of compassion. It is a resurrection of hope. It wasn't a reward for being extra good. No, what this resurrection signified was that the hope that Tabitha had brought to that community of widows did not end when she died. That ongoing work would continue. The story of her resurrection in that time and in that place is a testament to the resurrection of Christ, an opportunity for her to continue testifying to the good news of Jesus Christ. The good news, a gospel of compassion and of service. Her resurrection points to Christ's resurrection. It is a message of hope, a promise that compassion does not die with her, just as hope did not die with Jesus. Because of Christ, we live in a world where resurrections happen, where all that is death, hunger, disease, homelessness, abuse, racism, all can be overcome by compassion.
Amen.
A compassion that is resurrected in our own hearts and lives when we do more than believe, but when we follow, when we apprentice ourselves to the teachings of Jesus Christ. And you and I, when we commit to that discipleship, to become apprentices to the teachings of Jesus Christ, we too are given a new life, we too are resurrected. New opportunities, resurrected. In that same compassion and that same hope that was exhibited in Tabitha, that was exhibited in Peter, that was exhibited in Paul, and that was exhibited in Jesus Christ. The story of Tabitha is a story of compassion that does not end. A story that points onward to the resurrection of Christ and the resurrection of us all. A story that calls us to be disciples of Christ and agents of compassion. We are called to be like Tabitha. We are called to be like Christ, living lives of overflowing compassion and good works to the least of these. And may the people of God say, Amen.
Amen.